in depth individually. But let's begin by talking about the American Bar Foundation project. And this was a very important landmark study of the entire criminal justice system, really the first direct observation of police officers at work. One of the more important products was Wayne Lefebvre's book Arrest, that many students in criminal justice are familiar with. Tell us about your involvement with the Bar Foundation project.
Well, I think the most important thing to acknowledge at the outset, the Bar Foundation study was indeed very, very unique. It came along at a time when there was a craving for, a great desire for more insight as to what was actually happening out there. And underfunding, sponsored by the Ford Foundation, they assembled a team of observers with specialties in policing, prosecution, courts, probation, parole, and they were to go out into the field and discover what was really going on. And that was achieved by connecting with the various national associations, so we had a kind of access that had never previously been provided. And the objective was to not talk about policy, to not look at books, to not look at manuals, but to look at what was actually happening on the streets, in the courts, in the prisons.
This was 1956, early 56, the first field observations. But prior to that time, there really hadn't been any direct observation of police at work in terms of what they actually did. So your first experience was in Milwaukee and then later Detroit?
Well, the study initially was committed to studying the entire country, but it got bogged down in 3 states because there was so much to discover. The first was in Wisconsin, the large city being Milwaukee. We also studied a lot of rural areas. We moved then to Michigan, to Detroit, and then subsequently Kansas.
You and the other members of the team went out in the field, first observations of policing. What did you find? What was it that really surprised you?
Well, the goal was, first of all, the goal was to understand the system as a system, to see how cases actually went through the system. There were a number of things that immediately became apparent. One was that what we were observing was in such sharp contrast with previously established images of how the police and other agencies operated. Great informality, enormous discretion being exercised by officers on the beat, a lack of coordination between and among the different parts of the system, the importance of the role of the individual officer as distinct from the executives up on top of the organization in determining what was actually going on. And probably one of the most significant things was the fact that we discovered in all of this informality some very strongly established practices that involved large numbers of people that were being processed through the system in an informal sort of way.
Can you give us an example of?
Well, for example, in the Detroit operation, we noticed that the Detroit Department was reporting that every year they arrested around 18,000 prostitutes. And we discovered that there was a unit within the department that had an organized program of harassing prostitutes in which they would go out, arrest them, bring them in for a night's detention, and let them out in the street, and was very routinized. So in many respects, it was a very structured but informal operation. These people never got into a court. There was nothing in the criminal law of the state of Michigan that authorized this process and this practice, but it nevertheless was there and accounted for a large piece of police business.
So that would be one particular problem that later on you developed problem-oriented policing to deal with.
It began to, it fed my early thinking about the fact that what police were doing with regard to prostitution was radically different than what they were doing with regard to homicide or with regard to house burglaries.
Right. And prior to the Bar Foundation research, people would think of policing in terms of what the criminal law said. If this is what the law says, that's what the police do.
A very mechanical process. The law is the law, we enforce the law, we do it across the board.
And if the chief said, here's our policy, that's what happened, and your research discovered that, well, actually officers on the street were doing...
There was no relationship between what was happening on the street and the provisions in the criminal law of Michigan.
Right. And so this really was a landmark finding of what the reality of policing was really all about. Now,
I think that can be punctuated by an observation that was made by a criminologist at the time, Don Cressy, who was one of our advisors, and who said that we had rewritten the books in criminology because one couldn't discuss the things that were being discussed in those books without now taking acknowledgement of the real world that we had uncovered.
Right. You've said that this was really a formative experience, and it's always made you kind of a skeptic of official data and about policing and so on.
Well, I think that's one of the lasting impressions that the Bar Foundation experience had on me, and that is that, and has affected my whole career, in that I've learned that unless one gets down to the bottom, unless one talks to the people who are actually carrying out the job and observes what they're doing, one can't be sure that one really understands what's going on, and that any research in criminal justice is lacking, in my view, if it's based upon studies of policies, interviews, surveys, and looks and examination of data without establishing what is happening on the street.
Right. You mentioned prostitution enforcement in Detroit. What were some of the other problems that you discovered and observed?
Well, it's another example of a massive, practice that was not visible to others. Is that if there was a complaint about a dispute, domestic dispute, assault, and if the police responded, and this was something in which people did not want police involvement, then they would simply ask for an ambulance to take care of the injured, and the police would say, we don't provide ambulances, but we also don't do anything about this kind of case. And they said, if you want to do anything about the assault or pin it down, it's a civil matter, go see somebody else. But we only take those cases where there's a willing complainant who is going to prosecute the thing through the courts.
And so domestic violence just simply wasn't reflected in official reports?
It fell off the screen early on, because you did not have somebody who was going to file a complaint.
Right. Now, the Bar Foundation project, you began with sort of a research agenda, a checklist, but that you certainly soon found that wasn't really useful. Can you explain?
Well, this brings us into the whole business of the focus with regard to the police aspect of the study. That is, there was a research plan, and the research plan with regard to police was to find out what was going on in these departments that related to many of the questions that were being raised in what was then called the professional model of policing. How did the police department operate? Was it properly allocated? What kind of uniforms were officers using? What kind of cars? How many officers were on beats? Questions of that kind, with the assumption that if you could answer all those questions, you could give them a rating as to what kind of a police department it was. And that research plan was contained in the original proposal for the study. I was sympathetic to that because that was largely the product of O.W. Wilson and his professional model of policing, and it was under O.W.'s sponsorship that I got involved in this study. But I had this deep feeling that this was not what the true issues in policing were all about, and that there was this other whole area of police discretion, how decisions were made, the use of authority, etc. So there was a lot of tension about that, but gradually the checklist got relegated to a very inconsequential sort of position role in the study.
But that shift represented a real paradigm shift in policing.
A major change. It was a very sore point. For a period of time, we would satisfy some of the pressures by quickly doing the checklist in the first day or so, and then get on to the real business of finding out what the police were doing, how they were doing it, how they were responding to cases, how they were interacting with the public.
So the old paradigm was these very formal aspects of patrol cars, uniforms, and so on. The real work of policing is what's going on out in the street, and that's what you uncovered in the.
And I think your point is correct in terms of the change in the paradigm. That is essentially our conclusion there was that meeting all of the items on the checklist did not necessarily result in good policing, and that one had to go substantially beyond that to look at what was happening on the street.
And what you found happening out in the street is really two important things that have influenced our thinking about police. First was this uncontrolled exercise of discretion.
Right.
And
at the lowest levels of the organization.
so the lowest ranking people were making the most important
Life and death issues.
decisions. And then the second aspect is that police work consists of all these discrete problems.
Yes, and that the function of the police was so ambiguous, so amorphous, and difficult. It was much more than just enforcing the law, that they were being called in on so many different things. The other thing that we discovered very early on was the police operated under the notion they were omnipotent. They could handle all this stuff. Just give it to us and we'll take care of it. And in reality, we discovered that this powerful military armed organization was rather limited in what it could do with the problems of crime in a community.
And one of the key concepts of problem-oriented policing is that the police need to
Be realistic.
Build partnership. Being realistic means building partnerships with other agencies, using non-criminal alternatives to problems,
And trying to prevent them in the first instance.
and all of that's really rooted in this early experience back in
I think
1956.
in retrospect I can say that, yes.
Right. After the Bar Foundation project, you went to the University of Wisconsin Law School in 1964,
Right.
and now opportunity to teach. We'll talk about that in a second.